Thank you, Eric, for this presentation. It's great to come with you on field. I think you brilliantly presented this research on different infrastructures, and I'm very surprised that there is no convergence between these two infrastructures studies. It's very striking for me. I'm not, of course, an expert of this kind of studies, but this is really a great outcome of this research, surprising the most. So we will take some questions, maybe 2 or 3, and you can answer when you feel like. Okay? Yeah, of course. Remy.
So thank you, Eric, for this very interesting presentation. I must admit that I'm really undershocked, and to see that they are diverting, I don't know how many tons per day they are putting in the water of waste, you know. If I very quickly check on Google, apparently it's 2,000 tons per day. In Delhi, it's 9,000 tons that they are collecting every day, and they are building mountain of waste. But seeing all this waste going for landfilling in the water, I mean, it's so completely stupid, incoherent, and it's a crime. And so I was interested knowing about the protests around this waste reform, because you showed that for the electricity people were protesting, but for the environment apparently nothing. In India, you know, we have a similar issue with the waste in Delhi as well as in many other cities. But and you have also pollution all along the littoral in different cities. Bombay, of course, is very famous for this. You have a lot of waste coming on the sea. But and you have protests. When the waste energy plant came up in Delhi, you got protests, you know. When this landfill collapsed in Gazipur last year, you got protests. And the municipality has been sent to the court, to the Green Tribunal in Delhi. It has been condemned. I mean, it's officially in illegality, and I don't understand how that kind of situation can happen in Lebanon, which is supposed to be a rich country, despite the war. I mean, it's wow. So it's more than a comment, but I don't understand how people led the state led to that kind of terrible situation.
Take more questions and I come back.
Can you talk in the mic, please?
Okay. You mentioned, is it on? Is it? Okay. So you mentioned that until 2006, at least the city of Beirut was getting electricity for 24 hours, and then it's a story of deterioration, and then there are power cuts. I was wondering, what is the role of the media to? Is it complicit with the state, or how is state actually addressing this concern of the public? Because I mean, from 24 hours to 12 hours power cuts every day means something to the normal general public. And what is the nature of the opposition towards the state? I mean, is it vociferous? It is heard or not? Existent or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. We have gone to your presentation very minutely, and we have seen that you're talking of a place or a country or a city in which fighting is on, and then there is political instability, then there is a regional communalism. And no, but those are the factors by which most of the European countries and cities have undergone, but still they are very, neat and tidy. So my question will be that in Lebanon, what is the role of education, which is more important for this type of work, because it entails professionalism by the companies, and the companies grow from education. So what I find that the main instrument is in education, which can create professionalism, and we find in Europe this is the main factor by which everything grows in a finer, best of the way, because most of the best universities are concentrated there. So, what is the role of education institute in Lebanon or in Beirut, which can give us a better results? Thank you very much.
Do you want to take the question now, or we have another question? It's up to you.
Maybe one more.
Okay.
Well, one is related to what Remy said, so you won't have to make too much effort. I'm really surprised to hear your presentation, because my impression was that Lebanon was doing very well post-conflict, and it was going through a good reconstruction process. And in fact, I think either it was 2004 or 2006, Lebanon was given the best post-conflict reconstruction award by UN Habitat, and Prime Minister President Hariri himself came to receive the award. So I wonder, and you have studied for the city for a longer period, was the situation better before, and 2004, 2006, I don't know which of the 2 years, it deteriorated afterwards. So why did the city slide down so much in front of two basic infrastructures that you have talked about, which is waste and electricity, both very basic to existence? And Lebanon is more developed country, so that's one question. And the second one is again related to waste being dumped in the city. Was it, in your opinion, a strategic choice to reclaim land, or there was no really alternative for sustainable waste disposal, even availability of land? And that green line you talked about, I'm not sure what is the dividing basis for that green line, why waste can't move from one region to another. So was it accidental that waste went to the sea, or it was a choice to reclaim land? I think that's the basic question. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll answer this question, and then we'll give you
Thank you very much for your comments and questions. First of all, I'll address the question about protests and also the role of the media in putting this crisis on the stage or not, and in what way. And so, what is the role of the opposition in that process? I think that yes, there is like a paradox between the very strong clamors that have followed the waste crisis in 2015, with lots of young people marching into the street, protesting the government, organizing very spectacular critiques against the way the government managed the crisis, and the very weak results they obtained. They obtained some results, however. For instance, they managed to have cancelled another PPP project that was supposed to follow on the first one that had proved wrong, and that clearly was a kind of dividing the pie between the different parties. Okay, so in a way they managed to block some of bad approaches. However, in the end, this has only stalled any process of finding a solution. The government is very reluctant in, for instance, introducing the sorting of waste and recycling, and at least it will take a lot of time. So now the government has plans to use the waste for waste to energy plants, which also attract critics, but I would not say massive critics. It's more like intellectuals protesting because they know that the country is not ready for implementing that scheme properly and in a sanitary way. And in the end, 3 years of protest have resulted in almost nothing, and a lot of anger and deceptions and disappointment. So, well, there are protests, but results are very few and very meager. And just as the protests about electricity or the lack of electricity have not resulted in any change. And why? Most probably because the way the political system is able to produce itself through elections that are very sectarian, that are not based on the real geographic distribution of the population. It's like we can say that the electoral system is based on a fictitious political representation, where most people that currently live in cities vote in rural areas, so they are not voting in their areas for the real stakes there, and they are not voting where they have stakes, you see. So this system results in reproducing the sectarianism rather than addressing the everyday needs. And I think this is one of the major aspects that hinder solutions. And this is also what hinders the opposition groups to really take power. For instance, they went on the municipal election, but they were defeated because even if they gathered about 1/3 of the voices, but it was not enough, and so they are not in power to change the thing. Now I would like to address your questions about yes, the role of education. It's also a paradox because in Lebanon there are a lot of very good universities that are training a lot of brilliant professionals that end up in the Gulf, for instance, working in Dubai, working in Saudi Arabia, where they are the executive for the Arab kingdoms there, and those people are by this way, in a way, remote from their place of origin, and they do not keep well, they keep a lot of relations with their place of origin, but more as they are sending remittances, they are buying homes with the money they are making in the Gulf, but in the end, they are not living in the city, and they are not, involved in the transformation of the situation, and so this mechanism, which is a very it's a lifeline mechanism for Lebanon, because it makes that a lot of money is poured into the country, but it is only money. It is not ideas. It is not new practices, and so it's a very sad paradox too. But the country is very well. The people are really well educated in Lebanon. They speak a lot of languages, etc. So it's a paradox. And I think to go to your question about this, probably yes, there was a shift in 2004, 2005. It was probably 2004. Hariri was assassinated in 2005, and this moment was a downturn. It does not mean that everything was well, and Hariri had launched several reforms that were very neoliberal oriented, and that were already digging the divide inside the society. But at the moment, the weaknesses of those policies were not that apparent. And it is after its death that, indeed, the processes went so bad, also because the regional turmoil grew, with a war led by Israel against the country, against Hezbollah in the country, with later on the Syrian war, which resulted also in about 1.5 refugees coming in a country of 4 million. You imagine, it's like about 1/3 of the population in a few months that come, and of course this also created a very difficult situation to address, and it also prevented some reforms, even if it was probably also used by the government to justify its it's non-action, if you want. Okay. But it's clear that the situation has been worse for the last 10 years, and thus preventing other reform, and preventing also a real political union at the heads of the state, because the Lebanese parties are very rifted, if I can say, between, for instance, the pro-Syrian regime and the opposition to the Syrian regime, and that are aligned with Saudi Arabia, etc. So when you have so big geopolitical divided inside the government, how can they just really implement these reforms? And your last question, was it a strategic choice to pour the waste into the sea at that precisely at that place? And I think that we can have this suspicion. I have documented elsewhere the first plans for transforming the city center, even before the civil war, and they already planned to have a reclaimed area at that moment. And we know that the man who authorized the garbage to be poured into the sea was one of the planners who did those plans. So it's possible that they used the idea to force, their projects. But of course, then it went much beyond what they expected, and they could not monitor the things. Okay, and so therefore it is maybe too much to say that it was a strategic choice. But the fact is that there were ideas that, in a way, allowed for this solution to be contemplated, at least. And then there were the events, which were very pressing, and they, at the time, they acted under very heavy pressure. And so, well, certainly there is a relation, but I would not say there was not a plot, but at least an interesting connection.
We have one question, I guess. Please.
But you've answered most of it, but I just wondered, because who would benefit from these reforms if they were implemented? Is it just a way of the rents being centralized versus now they're just kind of distributed widely across the state and groups for political stability? What's the real constituency for them? And maybe that just explains why they're not getting implemented.
Yes, we can wonder if maybe the side of the ones who would have benefited from the reform was not strong enough in a way. Who was on this side? We can imagine that there were international companies, for instance, interested in managing waste, but in the end they were prevented from entering the country, and it was more local groups that benefited the contract. If we think about water management, there was a French company coming in, and after 5 years they pulled out because they were not really, they did not find a situation that helped them to really implement their project. Regarding electricity, the French company, the French utility, EDF, was clearly waiting for a contract, but in the end they were marginalized. And so we can say that the way the political economy of Lebanon worked, where they served first the interest linked to the local political groups, certainly in a way discouraged also for instance, external money lenders to put a stronger pressure, as they do in other countries. For instance, in African countries, they are very, very strong to push for their champions. In that case, well, they said, okay, it's the Lebanese, they let them. Well, Lebanese is a very, very nice country to live in, but if they want to live in their shit, okay, let them. let them do. What can you do in the end? And so there is a kind of, this general disappointment, including among the, I think, the international brokers who had an obvious interest to push for their own companies. You see. And in that, we can argue that it is because the economic sector, the Lebanese economic sector, was strong enough to make it by itself, that in the end, it may be an explanation why reforms were not implemented.
Another question, maybe? Yeah, Pato.
So, Eric, a whole bunch of questions. Because first of all, as Remy has already said, it's relatively easy to connect both your waste and your electricity to India. I mean, Delhi itself went through exactly this kind of waste crisis not too long ago. But that was done out of from a strike by municipal workers because they were not getting paid. Right? So that was the sort of genesis of that particular crisis. And because there was a dispute between the local government, which is responsible for the waste, and the state government, which was in some sense, they belong to different political parties, etc. So one, to try and understand the politics of this a little bit better. And the same, of course, electricity until very recently and even today in many of our cities, especially the smaller cities, can be of similar quality. But we had, Valerie Clerk, whom you might know, she's presented here, and then also Melanie Kamet, who's been working on health in Lebanon. But Melanie's presentation was more, if I recall correctly, where there was a strong role for the various factions, the Druze and the structures, etc. And I was trying to understand whether in waste in India, in many places, is also a resource that is people want to control because of the recycling benefits, etc. Power supply, again, is a business that people want to control because to make revenue from it. So, how does this factionalism within Lebanon relate to the kind of business there is? Or is it this way of supply in that particular story? So, if you could tell us a little bit more about how the politics and the factionalism interacts with the commercial aspect of this, that would be nice.
No, I'm glad that you highlight some parallels between the Indian and Delhi situation and the Lebanese case, because I was not precisely aware of these intersections, and I think they indeed offer some echoes between the two situations. First of all, in the case of waste, there was no strike by the workers, but there was one regarding electricity, and specifically the distribution sector. When they started the process of reform, as I said, the people that worked in the national company were not a civil servant. They were hired on a daily basis, on a contractual basis, and as I said, they were clearly, this was clearly associated or connected to political interest. And so the workers went on strike. Why? Because they said, well, for many years, our patrons, our political patrons, have kept our contracts on with the promise that in the end we will become civil servants. And now you want to privatize us, and you want to send us to the private companies. Okay, and so they implemented a strike that was very, I would say, clever, because they continued to go and to collect the bills at home, but they kept the money for them, and they did not return it to the utility. And so, by doing so, they forced the state to negotiate with them, and in the end, the state promised to offer them a position in the national company. But it was a complex process, and many of those, in the end, did not benefit from this compromise, and so they renewed strike, etc. So there was a round of strike, and in the end, also, it appears that one of the private companies was a very good company for working, and so about 300 or 500 working there went not on strike anymore, while the other, which were badly managed, continued the strike. So you see, it became a very local and very specific situation, where the political and the factionalist belongings certainly played a great role. So we have this clearly in the electricity sector. What I'd say is that, however, in contrast to the health management that Melanie Kamet analyzed, I would see a certain specificity of waste and in the electricity, maybe because of their well, for instance, the generator sector, which I mentioned, so these informal alternatives are partly connected with local patrons, but partly only. And I think that it cannot be reduced to the factionalism. It is part of the landscape, but it's not the sole explanation. And also for the waste management, it's not very sectarian or very factionalist. For instance, now we have municipalities that are refusing to open a dump site on their territory, saying we don't want to receive the waste coming from the Shias or from the Sunnis. Okay, but it is also very much connected. It is more of a sectarian discourse, also to preserve the real estate values on the certain municipalities. And you see, very often in Lebanon, we have to distinguish between a sectarian discourse and practices that are really sectarian and that really want to build the community. So I think it's a case-by-case study, and it's not always. Sometimes I would say it's too easy to call for factionalism as an argument. Sometimes it works, and sometimes not. So we have to be really, really on the matter and look at the case-by-case analysis.
If this was a smaller Indian state with this level of local control, every businessman trying to provide a service like this would need to make local payoffs, because all factionalist leaders are also local bosses. They control a variety of things. And obviously, as you said, if the local electricity company employees can collect money and then keep it with them, then obviously there's a whole degree of decentralization that is there. So it's curious that, and there I'm curious about how much of this is because of remnants of the older nature of the state. I mean, so what I don't get a sense for representation, maybe it would help us understand it, is before this kind of breakdown, how did the state work? Right? Because some of that of the functioning parts and the lack of these things would be related to the functioning nature of the state before it started to go apart. There's a certain professionalism involved in it. There's a certain structure involved in it. So if it was a sense of how that worked before, then maybe it would help us try and understand how, in certain aspects, even though there is a very clear politicization at the local level, these kinds of services are still to some extent are able to insulate themselves from that level of factualization.
Yes, thank you for these reflections, and I think they help me to indeed go further in the differentiation, for instance, between health and other civil services, and some more material or more grounded infrastructure. For instance, electricity has been, it was first a private operation granted to private companies in some cities of Lebanon during the French mandate. So it was very much connected to the strategy of, I would say, of power building by the French colonialism. So to have some families aligning with them, etc. Then later on, the independent state of Lebanon began to uproot these private companies, to expropriate them, and to amalgamate them into a national utility. And around just before the civil war in Lebanon, this national utility was certainly one of the sectors where professionalism, as you said, and a certain ethos of civil services was to be observed more than in other sectors of public action, like health, for instance, or education, where religious organization and political organization probably managed to keep a stronger part, and also probably the political groups in the government wanted to preserve areas of services as their own property, to say so. Okay, and while, for instance, what electricity, it was agreed that it was the state. Okay, and so I think that in the long run, electricity better resisted than other sectors. However, as you can see from my presentation, nevertheless, there were, from certain political groups, the temptation to seize part of those people and of those services. And it's not, for instance, the fact that distribution is, because it's probably closer to the terrain rather than generation, you can see a difference inside the sector. Okay, but I would say that I would argue that electricity is a little bit more preserved than sorry.
With the generators, these private generators, directly to
no. These private generators, they do not sign contract with the state. It is initiated from local initiatives, and only later on the state is trying to regulate it, but only superficially. So it's not like the big generation units that are still managed by the national company. So we also have to differentiate between these two sectors. And in a way, the factionalist system, it is trying to manage the informal private generator system, while the state is still the state units is still the state units. Okay, you see. So yes, indeed, we have to look very finally the sectors, the subsectors, etc., to see this mapping and the connections that can be established with the factionalist system.
Okay. Quick one, please.
So you have explained everything. You have explained almost the reasons for the failure of the system. Now, what do you think is very important, the most important part? Is it the government? Is it the local self-government? Is it the system? Is it the company? Is it the professionalism? Is it what sort of, should come first so that things can improve? Any thought on that subject? On your priority, which is the best priority?
Okay, thank you. Marie-Hélène, you have one question too?
Relating to this question, and Pato made me just think about this question, because this kind of debate actually is very much the kind of debate that happened here, and we had one session, I think Pato will remember, about Mumbai and access to water, which turned out to be a very disputed seminar because of access to water between Muslim and Hindus, and there are really different ways of interpreting it, as whether it is, the state really having strategies to discriminate, or whether it is other factors that explain the disparities. And I also think there's a lot of difference between large infrastructure, because often they've been managed at a higher governmental scale, and they often kind of have also a very homogeneous effect. In fact, the large networks, water and electricity in particular. And within the reform package, I don't know if it is the case in Lebanon, there's that much question, but in India, the neoliberal reforms went along with decentralization, political decentralization. And one of the arguments was that this, distant state was not able to provide and to respond to the local demand. But in a way, it had kind of created networks that were not sectarian, in some ways. So decentralization is also a very paradoxical instrument. So I just want to know whether in Lebanon you had as well that debate on political decentralization, and how it played out in terms of, maybe providing better services because it's closer to the users, or actually increasing to some extent intermediation and maybe the role of brokers, or political or non-political brokers.
Olivier, one final thing. Yeah. When the new land is created by dumping of waste, who controls that land? Because you're creating this new land, is there a dumping company who is controlling that land? Is it part of the state? Who gets rights to use that newly created land?
Thank you so much, because the questions are more and more challenging, and more and more also interesting to indeed analyze connections between different contexts. I'll start with the last question: who controls the new land? Theoretically, since it is built on the sea, this falls into the public domain. So it should be managed by the state, or more precisely, by the ministry in charge of managing the seashore. But there has been a long story of privatizing the seashore in Lebanon, mostly at the start for touristic endeavors. So there is a system of derogation and concessions that indeed has taken way. And therefore, the very big land reclamation is managed by the private company Solidaire, which I mentioned for the city center, in exchange for paying the infrastructure that the state could not pay in money, and so they paid the company in land. Okay, so, and for the new reclamations, it is expected that indeed similar schemes will be implemented. And I have to say that in between, just the works that are currently undertaken to organize the reclamation, then that will be needed to clean the reclamation, and then in the end to plan it. All this creates a lot of opportunities for markets, and if you control the state, then you will get the market. You see, so formally it's the state, but the way it depends on how you can get contracts with the state. Second point, what should be first change in Lebanon? Maybe I will disappoint you, but I think what is worse in the political system in Lebanon is the electoral system, is the fact that the people are not voting where they live, because this creates a very strong distortion between the place where they live and where they have stakes, and the people they do not elect, because they elect other people. And so this system, even if it is based on vote, is absolutely not democratic. And I would say that I would hope that a system where you make the people closer to the place they live in, then would be a better system. But this is my analysis, but it might not prove enough to change the thing. But I think first it could be great. And then this leads to the question of decentralization, indeed. And it's interesting to see that decentralization is a common issue between so many places that have experienced neoliberalization. However, in Lebanon, for instance, if you look at the case of water, in the case of water, we do not have a decentralization reform. We have more like a re-centralization, because water was, until recently, managed at the very local level, at the level of cities and villages. There were local committees managing the sources, etc. And so the state took the decision to give the right to manage, and so the right to the sources, etc., to regional bodies, in order to precisely escape from factionalism. However, it proved very difficult, and this reform has been only partly implemented. But you see that the implementation was here in the sense of re-centralizing rather than decentralizing more. But in the case of electricity, as I have shown, they have split the country in three parts, and so it's more like a kind of decentralization. So you see, once again, you don't have a convergence in the directions that are taken for reform, and so it makes it so difficult to analyze according to the same theoretical grid.
Do we have more questions? I think that's it. Yeah, we have got already a long day. So thanks again, Eric, for participating. You did 2 talks today. So thank you very much for this. And I think, as you say, it's very difficult to compare countries, cities, etc. But CPR-CSH workshop is, I think, the great platform to do so and to link places up together. Thank you.